welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today to discuss assorted security challenges and possible solutions to them in the Caribbean is Welder Alejandro Sanchez. He is a senior non-resident associate at the Americas program of the CSIS think tank Center for Strategic and international studies. He also is a contributor to a wide variety of defense publications, the president of Second Floor Strategies, which is his own consulting firm based in Washington. And he's also a contributor to various book chapters and a non-resident research associate at Expediente Abierto. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. If you could tell us a little bit about your various and diverse research interests, which range from geopolitics to trade and security, and encompass both Latin America and Central Asia and many other things in between, that would be great. You seem to have quite a broad spectrum of interests.
Sure. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight, actually. And let's see, I'm originally from Peru, and I grew up in a military family. So my interest on defense and security issues has been with me since I was a child. So I'm lucky enough to work on a field I'm always been passionate about, which is defense and security issues, military issues, and how they affect and the link between them and geopolitical issues, both across Latin America and worldwide. So that'll be my major interest, defense and security issues. I have a specific issue on military defense acquisition programs. So whenever a country and armed service buys tanks, helicopters, patrol vessels, satellites, I'm very interested in it. And because of my work, I cover different parts of regions for different clients, and also let's put it like that. For example, for defense news and analysis companies like Jane's, Shepard Media, Breaking Defense, the Center for International Maritime Security, I focus on everything that has to do with Latin America and the Caribbean. So anything between from Mexico to the tip of Argentina, the 33 countries, plus obviously the United Nations, the United States military's relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the role of the relationship between extra hemispheric actors, anything from Russia, China to France and the United Kingdom, with Latin America and the Caribbean. That's my main focus. And then I have slowly expanded over the years to other countries and parts of the world which I don't think get sufficient attention, like let's say from Washington or Brussels, or other global powers. I've been working on Moldovan affairs, defense and foreign policy, for around 15 years. I think I started in 2008, 2009. And then because I thought that this was a country where they have the Transnistria separatist issue, and I did not think that country and that issue was receiving enough attention. So I started working on that, and obviously then Crimea happened, then Ukraine happened, and obviously now Moldova's importance in Eastern European Black Sea geopolitics has exponentially grown. And the other country that I work in, I do a little bit of work again on Central Asia, especially on Kazakhstan. And it was the same thing. I started working on Kazakhstan because I was very interested when I learned about their participation for the first time, it was around 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, it was 2018, in a United Nations peacekeeping operation, UNIFIL, which is in Lebanon. It was the first time that the Kazakhs had sent, I think, around 120 peacekeepers. And I come from, again, because of my background, in my long-time interest in military affairs across Latin America, which includes the role of Latin American militaries in peacekeeping operations. I was very interested that Kazakhstan was sending peacekeepers for the first time abroad. So I started working on Kazakhstan because of their peacekeeping military angle. And then again, this was way before Ukraine, and I realized, Kazakhstan doesn't receive enough attention, especially in Washington, where I am based. And I started working on more issues relating to Kazakhstan, like Kazakhstan defense policies, Kazakhstan foreign policy. I started slowly evolved into other issues such as Kazakhstan's environmental challenges, and the Middle Corridor, the Trans-Caspian International Route, which is a initiative which links essentially Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey in order for Central Asia to deliver commodities through the Caspian Sea, through Turkey to Europe, bypassing Russian territory. But again, going back to Latin America, that's always been the region that I focus on the most. Because I'm from that region, of course, and because there's certainly so many things that we can talk about. And again, when it comes to Latin American militaries, I cover anywhere from Mexico to Argentina, anything from submarines to satellites. So there's always something going on.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And actually, now that you mentioned it, I would say that Caribbean in particular, but also many issues in Latin America are also overlooked or have been until very recently. It was sort of considered for the last, couple of decades, the backwaters of U.S. Foreign policy. Now it's actually becoming a major nexus for international interests and not only trade-related issues, but also security concerns, geopolitical interactions, and as well as trade and development. What caught my eye was your discussion of security issues in the maritime Caribbean, which you wrote in your column for CIMSEC, the Center for International Maritime Security, of which you are also a member. And, Caribbean in particular has been completely neglected in the international press, with the exception of the occasional Haiti-related article and the efforts to bring Kenyan peacekeepers there, which so far have not worked out. So, what exactly are the major maritime concerns in the Caribbean, and why should we be paying attention to them?
So let me answer with the article that you're mentioning. Yes, I'm a writer for CIMSEC, the Center for International Maritime Security, and I have a column that I write for them every couple of months, and it's called the Sovereign Tide, in which I address maritime security issues across Latin America. So in the past few years, I've written about, let's see, why United States Sovereign Command should have permanently assigned vessels like a hospital ship or littoral combat ships. I wrote an article last year about the status of the Uruguayan Navy. I've written about hospital ships across Latin America. I've written about the rising role of female naval officers and Coast Guard officers across Latin America and the Caribbean. So I touch on a variety of different issues. And what happened with the Caribbean is that, again, because I monitor on a daily basis military defense and security issues across Latin America, I knew that exercise Trade Winds, which is a US-sponsored exercise, which happens annually, was going to happen later this year in the summer in Barbados. And then I was reading some more articles and I saw that, the United Kingdom has just had a high-profile military conference with Caribbean heads of state, Caribbean leaders, Caribbean defense leaders to be exact, in Guyana. Then I read about how Event Horizon is an exercise among Caribbean militaries and Coast Guards taking place across, I believe he was in Jamaica, if I'm not mistaken. So I realized that there are a lot of exercises, a lot of high-profile meetings happening just this year across the Caribbean, and I had not seen other analysis that had really summarized and brought it all together. And I thought, this would be something new, something I haven't seen before, and this will help raise the profile of the Caribbean to the Washington crowd, to a Washington DC-based audience, to an audience of experts interested in maritime affairs from across the world. So the article has been pretty well received. Now, to your question about why is what's happening in the Caribbean these days? Well, there's a lot of things happening. The Caribbean continues to be a hotspot for drug trafficking, and this is nothing new. I remember that during my research, I found a few weeks ago an article from the New York Times from 1991, and they were describing the process of drug trafficking for the Caribbean, and they called it island hopping. And the fact that we are still talking about the island hopping drug trafficking strategy today shows that this problem goes back a long time. That's nothing new, but the fact that this strategy has not really changed that much for the past 3 decades and counting really tells you a lot that drug trafficking is a challenge that has not gone away, that has not been successfully addressed so far. But there are other security challenges and defense challenges in the Caribbean. There is obviously migration going on from Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, individuals from those countries trying to go to the United States in search for a better life. You have migration going through the Caribbean, but it's from individuals not from the Caribbean. Now they may be coming from Africa. They come from Africa. They reach sometimes Brazil or the Caribbean. Then they go to Central America, and then they try to make their way up north towards the United States. So there's a lot of migration from different parts of the world going on in the Caribbean. You also have other crimes like illegal fishing, which is a major problem. You have piracy, which is not as bad as the Horn of Africa or the Red Sea, but it's still a problem for the region. You also have interstate disputes, territorial disputes. And it's something that I always like to mention, that Latin America and the Caribbean are not are violent regions for sure, but the kinds of violence that we see in these two regions have evolved or morphed over the past few decades. The last interstate war in Latin America and the Caribbean was in 1995 between Peru and Ecuador. The previous war before that was the 1982 Falklands-Malvinas War between Argentina and the United Kingdom. That's the good news, that it's been over a quarter of a century since, almost 3 decades since the last interstate war in the region. However, there's still border disputes. You have Venezuela and Guyana. They have dispute over the Essequibo region. You have the International Court of Justice has actually ruled on several Caribbean-focused border disputes, or has pending cases regarding the Greater Caribbean states. Venezuela and Guyana is one example. There's another one between Honduras and Belize, between Guatemala and Belize. And a few years ago, the ICJ also ruled on a border dispute between Nicaragua and Colombia, or the Providencia Islands and the water around the maritime territory around them, which is in the Caribbean. So there's a lot going on, like drug trafficking, human smuggling, of course, some piracy, especially between Guyana and Suriname, border disputes, there's weapons smuggling as well. So there's quite a lot happening. And moreover, and I apologize for the long answer, but there's a lot that needs to be mentioned, are challenges that are not defense and security in nature. And by that mean are natural disasters. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, whenever there's a natural disaster or even a man-made disaster, defense forces, militaries are the front line, essentially the first responders, alongside obviously some civilian agencies. When it comes to the Caribbean, one problem that happens every year are hurricane seasons that happens during the late summer months. And they have already hit several, pretty much all Caribbean islands, Central American countries as well, not to mention Florida, in the United States. You have ETA and IOTA in 2020. Irma, I think it was in 2019 or 2017. So we know that they happen, they're going to continue happening. And something that I mentioned in the article for SIMSEC is that recently the scientific community has suggested that hurricanes should have a category 6 because climate change is going to make them even more destructive. And we can just expect that a category 6 to happen eventually, if not already, to occur in the Caribbean. That's a major problem. And finally, there are other natural disasters like earthquakes. There was a major one that hit Haiti in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. That was quite devastating. So unfortunately, the Caribbean suffers from several natural disasters. And when they occur, militaries are very much engaged in humanitarian assistance, disaster response operations.
Well, it's very much definitely a happening region, and thank you for this in-depth overview. And if you look historically, Caribbean has always, long before even the U.S. came into existence, played a central role in international trade, both positively in terms of connecting together Europe, on colonial powers, Africa, and this part of the world, and also negative as being a major part of the triangle of the slave trade and also criminal activity, piracy is legendary. So what is it about this location that has, on the one hand, historically has attracted so much interest, but on the other hand, has, despite the fact that it continues very much to be that this important geographic connector, has made it fall out of sight in terms of major geopolitical considerations?
That's a great question. I think that the Caribbean was very much a hot spot during the Cold War. I mean, of course, you had Cuba that fell to that had the revolution in 1959. You had Nicaragua, which borders the Caribbean. They had a successful revolution in 1979 with the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega. You had incidents where there were left-leaning, there were uprisings by insurgents that may have had a left-leaning communist socialist ideology. Obviously, the Central American wars are very well known in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. There were obviously U.S. military operations across the Caribbean during this period, Dominican Republic in 65, Panama in 1989 when Noriega was overthrown. There was one in Grenada in 1983, I'm not mistaken. But then, and obviously at the time, the major fear was that the famous domino effect, essentially that, well, if one country becomes a Soviet satellite, then the next country becomes Soviet satellite, and all of a sudden U.S. national security, national integrity could be threatened. And of course, that was the fear when Cuba fell, then when Nicaragua fell 2 decades later, and that was the major concern in Washington. Also, when the Cold War ended, Washington's historical competitors withdrew from, especially, but obviously I'm talking the Soviet Union / Russian Federation. Their interest in the Caribbean dramatically decreased. So there were, and there was also there was no longer a need for Washington to be heavily involved, especially militarily involved in the Caribbean, because there was simply no other threat. Then other things happened, or other crises around the world, of course, the war in between the war between Iraq and Kuwait, during the early 1990s. Obviously, the 9/11 happened. The war in Afghanistan commenced as well. Then the new war in Iraq. Now the war in Ukraine. But when it comes to the Caribbean, and I can really say in that for all of Latin America, but it's focused on the Caribbean, there's no opponent, there's no country that has that is a challenge to the United States. There's no Latin America and the Caribbean are nuclear weapon free zones. There's no North Korea. There's no Iran or any country like that. There's no regional superpower like China or Russia as well. Even if you combine probably a lot of militaries together, they wouldn't be a challenge towards the United States. And also, and it's something that I always mention, the Western Hemisphere has 35 countries, from Canada to Argentina. Take out the United States and Canada, so Latin America and the Caribbean have 33 countries. Out of the 33 countries that are left, the vast majority have Washington-friendly governments. The only exceptions really are Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, and we may have to add to the list El Salvador now, because President Bukele was recently reelected. It's becoming much more friendly towards China and very critical of Washington. So the vast majority of Caribbean states, not only are they military weak, so they don't present a challenge towards the United States, but also the governments are friendly. They say we want U.S. investment, we want U.S. trade, we want to have trade agreements and the sort, and cooperation agreements, development agreements when USAID to come here. So there's no reason for the United States to be really focused on the Caribbean as a strategic region that is a threat. And obviously the crimes that are committed there, like drug trafficking, the problem is that you cannot defeat drug trafficking by sending tanks or not to Jamaica or something like that. It's just, or building a military base in Barbados or something like that. It doesn't work like that. So unfortunately, U.S. Sovereign Command, which is the region of the U.S. military that oversees most of Latin America and the Caribbean has historically been regarded as the lowest priority command compared to Eurocom, which oversees Europe, or CENTCOM, which oversees the Middle East and the Arab world and Central Asia, or PACCOM, or how it's called, Indo-PACCOM, which oversees Asia and the Pacific. The U.S. Army Command has to struggle to often obtain resources, assets, because having to make the case that, oh yeah, there are major challenges going on across Latin America and the Caribbean that justifies us having a bigger budget is sometimes difficult. Now, the Caribbean is attracting renewed attention slowly, mostly because of China. And it's not even Chinese military operations in the Caribbean. It's mostly Chinese investment that's happening across several Latin Caribbean and Central American states. And the problem is that what China has done over the past decade and a half, more or less, is that Beijing has bought, and I use that word very on purpose, Beijing has bought the diplomatic recognition from the few countries that still recognize Taiwan. And they have switched to recognizing China in exchange for investments, loans, and credits, and that sort of thing. So China's global rise is definitely a major concern for Washington, and their strategy for befriending Caribbean states through investments and loans are also a major concern for Washington.
Now, you're pointing out this very interesting geopolitical shift, but meanwhile, I see a little bit of a contradiction in what U.S. says versus what it's doing. So what the U.S. recently stated in response to concerns expressed about Iranian ships coming to Brazil and things of that nature was, I forgot who in the State Department, might have been Secretary Blinken or somebody else. Basically, the statement was that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. It is no longer a U.S. policy. That was, and Monroe Doctrine dictates that U.S. Takes all necessary measures to protect from foreign threats in its neighborhood, the Latin America, Western Hemisphere in general. But on the other hand, you, at the very start of this conversation, pointed out to the proliferation of military exercises in the Caribbean. How do you explain this this conundrum? What exactly are they preparing for if the Monroe Doctrine is officially retired?
I mean, definitely, the Monroe Doctrine has historically been very unpopular in Latin America and the Caribbean because it just implies that somehow the region is like a servant of Washington, and obviously nobody wants to be think of themselves or be perceived as servants of somebody else. Definitely, and obviously there's always been a bit of a contradiction when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine, especially during the Cold War and nowadays, because it's not that Washington, because if we go back, if we follow the word of the Monroe Doctrine, then Washington should be against the presence of militaries from the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands, which are the free European countries which have overseas territories across the Caribbean, which have a military presence there. But obviously, that's not really the problem. The problem for Washington is obviously when countries that are its competitors, like Iran, Russia, and China, are militarily present in the Caribbean and the rest of the Western Hemisphere. So there's always been a bit of a contradiction. The thing is that, like I mentioned also previously, most Latin American countries and Caribbean countries want to have cordial relations with the United States. They welcome U.S. military activities. They want military assistance, the donation of aircraft, patrol vessels, military exercises. The militaries from the Caribbean, Latin America, they love coming to the United States to train, whether it's at the National Defense University, the Inter-American Defense College, the Inter-American Defense Board, or any other institutions that military institutions that you can find across the United States. They love having this type of close relationships. So I understand the contradiction, but at the same time, when I read the statements from Caribbean militaries, when I interview or I hear Caribbean leaders, civilian leaders talk, they're perfectly fine with that. They say we love the cooperation that we have with the United States. We want the relation. We love the relationship that we have with the United States. We just want to be treated as equals. So let's forget about the moral doctrine. We just want to be treated as equals, and we want to have a close relationship. I will say that me being in Washington, I go regularly to different meetings and conferences where there are officials or delegations from several Latin American and Caribbean states that come to Washington. They try to go to the White House, the State Department, USAID, Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They're just here trying to have meetings, all the VIPs from the DC, Washington officials, as many as they can. Obviously, go to Congress as well, because they want to secure that kind of relationship. One example is that just 2 weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, there was a delegation of ministers from Suriname that was in Washington. It was, I believe, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice, and the director of one of their oil companies. And they went to the State Department. They had a couple of meetings. They also had a public conference that was open to the public, in which I attended, in which they praised the bilateral relationship, saying, "No, we come here because we want it to be even stronger than it was during past administrations." So my point is that yes, I think that Caribbean governments, as well as the rest of Latin America, they want to have a strong relationship with the United States, but most they understand that they don't want to just limit themselves to only being having trades and strong partnership with the United States. For them it's perfectly logical to train for let's say Guyana. For Guyana for Georgetown, it makes perfectly sense that the Guyana Defense Force is going to buy a patrol vessel from Metal Shark, which is a U.S. based shipyard, and for the Guyana Defense Force to train with the U.S. military. But at the same time, they're going to be receiving investments from China. For them, it makes perfect sense, because they're just want the best for their country. I understand that Washington may not like that very much, but that's a reality.
So what can you tell us about this pattern of increased exercises? Yes, it's true that US has consistently been engaged, but you pointed out that there has been an uptick in this military activity. What's behind all of this? Why?
I won't say that it's an uptick, because the number of again, U.S. Sovereign Command, I still think is one of the lowest priorities commands that in the U.S. military, even though I don't think it should be, and it should receive more assets, especially vessels and aircraft. They do and I think the Sovereign Command, they do a lot with what limited resources they have. So I wouldn't read too much into the exercise trade winds, because it's an annual exercise that happens anyways. I wouldn't say that it's an uptick. I would just say that there's a lot going on in the Caribbean these days. And I think that it's just one of the reasons why what I've seen an uptick of are high-level meetings, and has to do a lot more with Venezuela. Last year, Venezuela had a very controversial referendum in December, in which they essentially voted between quotations, because I don't recognize the referendum or the Maduro regime as really legal, or really legal. But so they have a referendum in which the population voted, again between quotations, in favor of really fully annexing the Essequibo region, which is controlled by Guyana, but which Venezuela has historical claims over. So after that happened, yes, you saw several high-ranking military officials and also civilian leaders go to Guyana. Like I said, you just had the UK Caribbean heads of defense meeting in Georgetown. I just read actually a couple of hours ago that a French delegation recently was just in Guyana a couple of days ago. They also met with the Guyana Defense Force. I believe Army General Laura Richardson, who was the commander of U.S. Sovereign Command, has also gone to Guyana. Last year, the HMS Trent, which is a British patrol vessel, also went to Guyana. sort of like show solidarity towards Guyana because of the aggressive tactics that Venezuela is carrying out right now when they claim the secure region. Yes, I see an uptick, an increase in defense-related interactions with Guyana in particular. But when it comes to the rest of the region as a whole, I don't think there's an increase. Actually, I think that if anything, I think that certainly what U.S. Sovereign Command deserves more vessels, more assets for them to increase their presence in the Caribbean to help regional partners in combat several crimes like drug trafficking.
Well, interestingly enough, this drug trafficking that you mentioned has appears to, in addition to the normal sort of activity taking place, there is also more of a geopolitical element with Hezbollah in particular using the region for its own money laundering and money making schemes. And there's also a potential not so much for big clashes between different state actors, but small wars or small issues related to non-state activity. You have indigenous uprisings. You have issues regarding assorted groups of narco-terrorists establishing their bases in the region, and of course you have intelligence activity and foreign militaries looking to take advantage of this sort of relative U.S. Inactivity for their own clandestine operations in the region. To what extent do you see Caribbean kind of turning back into this semi-Cold War region for operational activity in light of everything that's going on?
That's a great question, and there's a lot to dissect. So let me try to break it down a little bit into smaller groups. When it comes to rates of an increasing of violence regarding drug activities, yes, we already see that happening. Best example is actually Ecuador, and we're moving away from the Caribbean, but it actually helps the point that prove the point that on the 9th of January, the Ecuadorian government announced a state of emergency. And essentially, because of the start of essentially a war against what these criminal gangs, which the Quito is describing now as terrorist or entities. I don't know if I would call them terrorists myself, but that's how the Quito now describes them. So we see so now as part of Operation Phoenix, the Ecuadorian military has deployed around 21,000, I think 22,000 even troops across the country to crack down on these criminal gangs / terrorist networks. When it comes to the Caribbean, I haven't seen an uptick, an increase in violence per se, but certainly it is a major problem. And for example, when it comes to France, I read an article from, I think it was France 24 or maybe Le Monde, that up to 20% or maybe 25% of cocaine that you can find in France, in mainland France, comes from French Guiana, which is the little French overseas territory, which is right at the tip of South America, like next to Suriname, north of Venezuela, north of Brazil, I'm sorry. So apparently up to a quarter of the cocaine that you find in mainland France comes from that little bit of overseas territory, and every day you have mules or couriers, drug mules that are trying to that find ways of bringing drugs to France. So that's obviously a big problem. And there have been certainly plenty of reports about an increase in drug trafficking in the Caribbean. And the problem is that even some high-level officials are involved in it. I think it was in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, that I'm not exaggerating on this, that the prime ministers of the U.S. Virgin Islands, if I'm not mistaken, was arrested in Miami and he's accused of being involved in corruption and drug smuggling. So I believe his trial was supposed to begin last year. Now it has been postponed. Now I think I read about that in January. But you can see that drug trafficking affects all levels of a government across the Caribbean. So and obviously drug trafficking continues to be a very profitable business, and drug traffickers from South America, Venezuela, the cartels of Mexico, in Colombia and Venezuela as well, they will continue to see utilize the Caribbean as a corridor to move their product either to the United States or to Europe. That's point one. Point two, when it comes to global powers and the Caribbean, I want to push back on that one a little bit, because yes, it's happening, but not as much as people think. Let's look at Russia for a moment. The Russia, before the war in Ukraine started, I believe that Russia was trying to move to increase once again its presence in the Caribbean. For example, they will send ship or a little flotilla of 2 ships maybe to the Caribbean to train with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba every couple of years. There was an incident in 2018 in which Russia sent 2 strategic bombers, the Tu-160s, which are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. They flew all the way to Venezuela. They landed there for a couple of days. Then they flew across Colombian airspace back to Russia. But since the war started, the Russian military activity in the Caribbean has dramatically decreased, as far as we can tell from open sources. They did send last year their training vessel, whose name escapes me right now. It went to Cuba, and then it went back to Russia. I don't think they're going to be able to send warships to the Caribbean anytime soon. With that said, yes, every now and then the Kremlin will issue a statement saying that, we are, since Washington is pushing in our sphere of influence, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Moldova, that area, then we should be doing the same. We should be increasing our influence in our military presence in the Americas. So every now and then you have a statement by some Russian policymaker that says that we're ready to send missiles to Cuba or nuclear weapons to another country, something like that. Nothing like that has happened yet, but yes, Moscow is, I think, will really like to increase its presence or activities in the greater Caribbean region among the few allies that it has in the region, namely Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, to somehow show to Washington that Russia should not be messed with or pushed around. Finally, when it comes to China's military footprint in Latin America and the Caribbean is actually negligible. Other than we talked a lot about Chinese investment in the region on controlling ports, hotels, and that sort of thing, that sort of infrastructure. When it comes to military sales, they've been, for example, very successful. They have donated in the past non-lethal, and I will stress the word non-lethal, military technology to Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados. We're talking about trucks, electricity generators, portable electricity generators, tractors, ambulances, small little patrol vessels for coastal operations. They've done over the past decade, but when it comes to actually selling heavy military equipment, it really hasn't happened. What China, I think, is trying to do is to develop military relations with Latin America and the Caribbean. So what they're doing is, besides donating equipment, non-lethal military technology, I will stress that again, what they are trying to do is invite Latin American and Caribbean military officers and troops to train in China. I believe they have a couple of Guyana Defense Force pilots have already trained in China. Just a couple of weeks ago, or I think last week, there was a naval workshop for Latin American naval officers in China. I actually may have been in Xinjiang, which is kind of funny that it was in the middle of a landlocked state. So I think that's really more of China's current strategy when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean, develop people-to-people relations more so than trying to open up a base or sell military equipment.
Well, interesting enough, speaking of drug trafficking and that sort of activity, has there been a shift from conventional sort of drugs to fentanyl, the way we have seen coming through the US border? Or do we pretty much see the same patterns as normal?
Same patterns as normal. Fentanyl is mostly produced, I believe, in Mexico, so they
Mm-hmm,
only need to use the Caribbean to get into the
mm-hmm.
United States. Obviously, there's a pretty open border between the United States and Mexico, so that's they don't really not need to go through water. If they already have the land option, they can build tunnels, literally have built tunnels to move the product. So when it comes to the Caribbean, I see mostly cocaine, some marijuana as well, but mostly just cocaine. That's the main product that comes again from South America through the Caribbean, using the island hopping technique strategy, using speedboats, the narco submarines, some Cessna aircraft, the narco planes, which mostly try to fly through Central America, more so than the sea, but it's usually just the same products.
Now, we're seeing a lot in terms of reorganization, in terms of um, well, we're seeing that on the one hand, there's a lot of maritime security concern in various parts of the world, in particular in the Middle East with the Red Sea and attacks and efforts to find different routes. On the other hand, the Caribbean is relatively quiet, but then we're seeing all these countries trying to modernize their shipbuilding activities, militaries. Do you see Caribbean playing a more strategic geopolitical role if other parts of the world become more plagued with sort of security problems?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? Do I see what?
Do you see Caribbean becoming a more
Okay.
strategically important area if other significant trade routes are overcome with security problems?
The Caribbean is always going to be important because you have Panama. You have the
Mm-hmm.
Panama Canal that links the Pacific Ocean with the Caribbean, and then you go to the Atlantic. If you do not go through the Panama, you have to go all the way north through the Arctic and over on top of Canada, or north of Canada. You have to go all the way through the south, through the Drake Passage and the Magellan Strait, south of Argentina, between Argentina and the Antarctic. So protecting the Panama Canal has always going to be of importance, especially for the global powers. That's one reason why the United States is concerned about China, because what China is doing is they're trying to buy companies like port infrastructure that operates alongside the Panama Canal. So that's something that Washington is very important concerned about. I'm not an expert enough about shipping lanes, global shipping lanes, to tell you, well, if you cannot go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, does that mean that more ships are going to go through Panama? I'm not an expert on that, so I cannot say that. Also, even though there have been some incidents of piracy across, especially between Suriname and Guyana, the situation is not as dire as in the Red Sea, that's for sure. With that said, military is trained not only for the challenges of today, but for the challenges of tomorrow. That's how they think. So it's good for Caribbean defense forces and their partners in the United States and elsewhere to think of a worst case scenario. What if piracy increases in the Caribbean and shipping and cargo vessels are attacked by some small pirate little flotilla of pirates? What will happen then? How are they able to crack down on this potential crime? So it's not a problem yet, but it could, as an analyst, I have to also think of the worst case scenario. What if it happens in the future? So Caribbean militaries need to be ready for that alongside with their partners. And while at the same time, I am glad that there are several countries across the Caribbean islands and Guyana that are acquiring new equipment. Guyana has bought, like I mentioned before, has bought a patrol vessel from the US based shipyard Metal Shark. The Bahamas has bought the Royal Bahamas Defense Force has acquired some interceptor craft from safe boats. The Jamaica Defense Force is buying new patrol vessels as well. I believe the Royal Bahamas Defense Force bought a couple of years ago a fleet of drones, of UAVs. The U.S. Army Command has helped revamp, repair, modernize the interceptor craft and coastal patrol vessels of countries like Antigua and Barbuda. So that's obviously very important. So while I see some what I see makes me hopeful, at the same time, is a pretty big sea. And the fleets that they have, well, they're doing these countries, I think the defense forces are really doing the best with what they have, is simply not enough. You need more assets in the air, you need more transport aircraft, you need more drones to properly patrol the maritime waters. You need more interceptor craft and patrol vessels. You need patrol vessels that are not just that are capable of carrying a helicopter, because that increases your over the horizon capabilities for surveillance operations and interception operations, and that's just not happening yet. Like I mentioned, Guyana, again, they bought a patrol vessel, a very modern patrol vessel, brand new. It has been built, from scratch by Metal Shark, but they've only bought one vessel, and you need many more to probably patrol Guyana's maritime territory and exclusive economic zones, especially given the threat you have with next door Venezuela. And so that's not happening yet.
I understand that Venezuela decided on the timing primarily due to its own failure to repay Chinese loans and the need to basically gain quick access to cash in the form of oil, of easily accessible oil. At the same time, another angle to this Venezuela standoff and their oil activity has been Trinidad and Tobago, which has been at one point considering potentially being able to export Venezuelan products, not only its own, especially due to the controversy over some of its own energy-related activity facing a slowdown, shortages, and lack of access to sufficient supplies. There's been a back and forth over Venezuelan oil sanctions, and at first some of them were lifted, then they were reinstated after Venezuela failed to comply with the U.S. requirements related to election norms and so forth. Where does this whole situation stand now? How is Trinidad able to take advantage of these sanction-related easements, or is it still facing the same conundrum?
I'm gonna acknowledge that I don't know the answer to that question about Trinidad and Venezuelan oil. I will add that it's not just Trinidad that is in this particular situation. It's also Curacao, which Curacao being an island which is an autonomous country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They have an oil refinery called Isla Refinery, which was controlled for several years, was operated for several years by PDVSA. Which is not Venezuela's state-owned oil company. I believe that Curaçao has finally managed to move away from being operated from PDVSA. The contract expired. There's still allegations that Venezuela is sending oil shipments to Isla Refinery. From there, it's going to third parties. So I'm not willing. I don't have the answer to how Caribbean oil politics are evolving because the in Trinidad and Tobago and other regional countries and autonomous countries like Curacao. But at the same time, we'll say, yeah, it's very complicated. And ironically, I think the best thing that could have happened for Venezuela was actually the war in Ukraine, because so through global energy politics and energy networks turn them into a giant mess, just to be very blunt about it. And really, that's the primary reason why the United States has revisited the sanctions, trying to figure out where some of them can be eased because they want to ensure that they have a constant supply of oil, since the Russian market, is shutting down because of the war, as we all know. So where is that gonna lead? I don't know. I do know that the Washington is in a problematic situation right now because Venezuela is supposed to have elections this year. And I'm going to use the quotes because I do not think they're going to be free or fair by any means. Nicolas Maduro is running for re-election once again. The primary contender, Maria Corina Machado, if I'm not mistaken her last name, she is a opposition candidate. Maduro has always said that the Venezuelan government has said that she cannot run for whatever bogus reason. So even though I think Corina is, certainly popular enough that she could get a majority of votes, she's certainly not going to be allowed to win. These elections are going to be a farce, and they're going to be, and Maduro is going to remain in power. And the thing is, like, how will Washington react? Will Washington continue easing oil sanctions, even though democracy is one gigantic farce in Venezuela? Or will they say, you know what, we cannot do this. We cannot just keep on trading oil for democracy? And will they be reimposed after the elections, so-called elections, occur? So that's something that's an issue to monitor.
Meanwhile, US has tried to offset some of these foreign actor-related challenges with economic policies. In the Northern Triangle countries, this administration has tried to, or at least vocalized a policy of attracting private capital, private investments. I don't know how much success that has actually had. I've heard very mixed reviews from that region. Has anything like that been also attempted in the Caribbean to stimulate development of these countries and make them more resistant to criminal activities such as drug trafficking as well as foreign meddling?
I think the basic answer is no. There is a constant level of engagement between Washington and its Caribbean allies and partners, for sure. I just mentioned a Surinamese delegation that came to town like 2 weeks ago. President Ali of Guyana came to DC, I want to say last year. And I think it was last year because I went to an event and I actually even asked him a question about the GDF. So Caribbean partners continuously come here. There's obviously the Summit of the Americas, which happens every couple of years, in which the United States, the president gets to engage and talk directly with Caribbean, his Caribbean partners and peers. So there's that engagement. I know several U.S.-based initiatives, but I don't think they've been very successful. I guess it's difficult for me to gauge to say that yes, this initiative have been successful at preventing, let's say, Jamaica or Barbados or Grenada or becoming more like falling under Russia's or especially China's sphere of influence, or becoming more corrupt. I don't think I can answer that question. I will say that Chinese investment in the Caribbean has slowed down, but that doesn't have to do much with U.S. involvement in the Caribbean as much as the Chinese economy has stagnated. So I think that's why they're revisiting a lot of their investment projects. So, and when it comes to the Caribbean, when I monitor what happening in these islands, it's not that things are getting worse, but I don't think they're getting dramatically better. It seems to be just a little bit stagnant, like they're just kind of at a standstill. Their investment projects coming in every now and then. Things are getting built or modernized, but it's not like a dramatic shift or anything like that. No, I cannot think of a Caribbean islands that's really doing that huge jump forward in terms of development, especially thanks to the United States.
At the same time, let's take a bird's eye view of the region. We've talked about, what US is lacking in terms of regional military capacity. We've talked about the shortcomings of the local navies and militaries. What if we're looking at it from the point of view of adversarial interests, be they state or non-state actors? What are some of the blatant vulnerabilities in terms of choke points and literals, or in terms of any preparations and resources that could be used for a strategic move against either U.S. interests or just destabilization in the region in general?
I think that geography matters to begin with. So I cannot see like the Chinese military not trying to like invade Jamaica or Russia trying to invade Grenada. Like the geography just wouldn't occur. Worst case scenario is what has already happened in the past couple of decades, which is that governments are democratically elected to power across Caribbean islands, and let's say Belize and Guyana and Suriname, and their policy and the leaders decide to have a very aggressive attitude towards Washington, and they prefer to be friendlier towards Moscow or Beijing or even like Tehran. Obviously, you have already 4 countries: Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Obviously, when he had President Lula da Silva, who was when he was recently re-elected in Brazil, there was a concern that, oh, is he gonna shun away from the United States and join and increase relations with the BRICS countries? Is he gonna increase relations with Russia and China? Funny thing, the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, she has been elected, I think, the first ever director general of the BRICS Development Bank or something like that was inaugurated last year in Beijing. You obviously had President Andrés López Obrador, whose 6 years in powers are about to come to an end. Obviously, he has a bit of has had a cold, frosty relationship with Washington. It was feared that would dramatically that López Obrador would somehow approach Russia or China. He didn't really do that too much, and bilateral relations, especially at the commercial level, remains generally the same. But I think that's really the worst case, a major fear for Washington. Not that there's going to be a military presence in all of a sudden in any Caribbean island, because again, most Caribbean islands want to have close relations with the United States, but that individuals can be elected to power in the democratic way, and their ideology is very anti-US or negative or belligerent against the United States, to put it another way. Could this happen? I mean, it really can always happen. We just had that with President Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. He was elected like 6 years ago, 4 years ago, 2019, to power. Funny thing, I actually went to see him when he was a candidate. He came to Washington to give a speech, and he went to the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative right-wing think tank here in Washington, D.C. He went to talk there as a candidate. I went to hear him live, and I saw him face to face. And he spoke about how he wants to be a good ally of the United States. He wants economic relations to continue. He's proud of the Salvadoran diaspora that lives in the United States and sends remittances. And obviously, since he came to power, he has behaved in an increasingly autocratic and democratic way. He's still very popular, but
my understanding that he's had some clashes, in particular with the Biden administration, over various internal matters, and one can argue about the legitimacy of those things, but regardless, the direction has pushed him away from the US and to China. In fact, he's been pretty open about it in looking to basically get US more interested because of China's interest in El Salvador. But so far, I don't see that has worked.
I don't think it has worked either. I mean, the funny thing about not the funny thing, but like the interesting thing about Bukele is that it's hard to kind of pin him down, because yes, he has approached China. I think it was just maybe last month that the construction, or I think it was last year, that the construction of a brand new national library commenced in El Salvador, and it's funded by Chinese aid. But at the same time, Bukele is known in Washington, I think around the world, as the Bitcoin president. He's like very in favor of cryptocurrencies, which is very much, so many US businesses actually like him because of that, because he's so pro Bitcoin. So you have different leaders across Latin America that have a complex relationship with the United States. And I think the Caribbean, generally speaking, has remained very Washington friendly. But of course, the worst case scenario is like, yeah, what if a leader like Bukele or Maduro gets elected in a Caribbean state? And that's why whenever I go to a law, that's why the issue of disinformation and misinformation has been widely discussed in Washington, and in a lot of meetings they go to about Chinese and Russian disinformation and misinformation in elections across Latin America and the Caribbean. Most of the examples the case studies that I hear about are based on Latin America, like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico as well. So I don't think disinformation and misinformation has been studied sufficiently when it comes to the Caribbean islands, but it's something that we should be certainly very concerned about. And again, what if the next Nicolas Maduro or Hugo Chavez really is elected in ex-Caribbean country? How will that affect U.S. relations with that particular country? It probably will affect them very negatively, and that's something that Washington should definitely be very concerned about.
So it seems to me that the real threats are not so much directly military. We're not talking about necessarily, an invasion from, Iranian flotilla or something like that. But we're talking about traditional hearts and minds and the ability of foreign actors to meddle with populist movements and local public opinion, and also relations with state actors, and whether U.S. can manage those relationships and navigate them successfully, or whether it basically gets, its policies ends up being kind of not being able to manage individual state actors and lose them to potential foreign competitors.
Absolutely agree. And somebody else who will agree with your statement is actually U.S. Sovereign Command. Every year, the U.S. military commands issue a document called a posture statement, which essentially is a summary of what they have done in the past year, what they plan to do for the next year, and what threats they observe in their area of operations. And it's always it's a unclassified document that anybody can download. So obviously I have to read it for my own work. And when you read the posture statements of Southcom in recent years, obviously they mention drug trafficking, HADR, natural disasters, that sort of thing, illegal fishing, and as regional threats. They obviously discuss Russia, China, Iran. They will obviously mention the presence of any Russian warship that comes through Latin American waters, and say, okay, we should be concerned about this. But the section that really always get the most, the document constantly focuses on as the assistance that the United States armed forces, U.S. military, the U.S. Southcom and its relevant agencies and partner agencies do in Latin America to win the hearts and minds. For example, something that's often mentioned is the Comfort, which is a U.S. Navy hospital ship. It's often assigned, or occasionally assigned, I would say, to U.S. Southcom. So they will do a little tour. They will go sometimes through several Caribbean islands, Dominican Republic, Guyana, Belize, Guatemala, Jamaica, several, 6 or 7 of them per mission. They will provide free healthcare to local communities. And that's the Southcom says, look, this is an example of us doing something very basic, very cheap, just fixing somebody's teeth, or performing some kind of surgery on them for free. That's going to make them the local population like the United States more. So let's invest on that. Another example are something called the U.S. National Guard's State Partnership Program, via which each National Guard from each U.S. state partners with an international the military of a country around the world. And this has been going on since 1993. For example, the military of Moldova, since I work in Moldova, and the North Carolina National Guard team up. When it comes to Latin America, it's I think Jamaica and the Washington, D.C. National Guard have teamed up for around 30 years, more or less. I believe Florida and Guyana are the ones that team up as well. Belize and the Louisiana National Guard team up as well. So besides training and capacity building, what also happens is that the National Guard troops from each of these National Guards will go every now and then to these countries and perform some kind of civic activity, rebuild a hospital, build a well for a local community so they can have access to clean water, install, I don't know, like fix a road or something like that. So something very low key, something that that we perceive as very low key, as a cheap initiative, but which have a very high positive impact. So it's like a low cost, high achievement, high results type of an operation. So I think that's something that the U.S. government should continue doing and provide the resources to U.S. Southern Command and other military and other relevant agencies to continue doing it. Because again, Russia is not going to build a military base in the Caribbean tomorrow. I know they, like I mentioned before, they continue to threaten. The Washington saying we're going to send nuclear missiles to Nicaragua or Venezuela, but that's really as many allies as they have in the Caribbean. China has no interest right now of having a military presence in the Caribbean either. So really, what the kind of influence that we're talking about, you cannot really combat it with machine guns or tanks or warplanes. You have to be very much smarter about it. And having a military presence to help combat drug trafficking is very helpful, of course, but also being involved in HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, carrying out peace aid missions via U.S. COMFOR, for example. Those are very, very helpful and effective.
Now, from the perspective of the U.S. average U.S. citizen, the biggest, domestic or near abroad to speak issue has been migration and border security, and that's all that that's been headlining the engagement with Latin America in recent couple of years. Now, a lot of it comes to the immediate, the funding of immediate local issues related to homeland security, but on the other hand, you also have the long-term foreign policy issues, of which mass migration to the border is a result, and it's also byproduct of the type of engagement US does or does not do with the various Latin American countries. How do you see that playing out? Do you see these underlying issues becoming more to the forefront? And they seem to be hard to articulate to the domestic audiences. All people see is, the final product of it, which is what the border crisis we are seeing now. How do you see that playing out? What can US do to manage it more effectively on the origin end?
I am of the belief that nobody wants to migrate just because they want to. It's because they have to. Again, as a Peruvian, Peru has received around over 800,000 to close to 1 million Venezuelan migrants/refugees over the past few years because of the crisis in Venezuela. So Peru is now also the host of a sizable Venezuelan diaspora. And when I've been to Peru, when I talk to them, they say, yeah, we migrate because of the Maduro regime, the economy. We have to leave, half our families behind. So it's not like they migrate because they wanted to; it's because they had to in search for a better life. Again, when it comes to the Caribbean, the majority of when you hear about individuals, when you hear of migrants trying to cross the Caribbean Sea to reach the United States, they mostly come from Venezuela. Usually they try to island hop. They leave Venezuela, they try to reach Aruba, Curacao, and Trinidad and Tobago because they're right above Venezuela, right north of Venezuela. So that's their main stop, their first stop. Then they try to go further north. Or you have, obviously, Cubans still trying to reach Florida, and there's been a massive amount of Haitians that have been trying to reach the United States, many of which have died trying to come to the United States and search for a better life. That's absolutely tragic. And when I've heard U.S. Army Command, DHS, the U.S. Coast Guard, and other relevant agencies speak, USAID, of course, on the civilian side, they think, we just have to make a better life for people in their home countries so that they won't want to migrate, bring more security and stability. There was actually a great report. I forget the source, so I apologize to the author for that. But it was actually El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
And El Salvador, and what the reporter wrote about was that over the past couple of years, we've heard about how tens of thousands of Salvadorians have been sent to jail. That Bukele says they were terrorists, members of Mara Salvatruchas, or what's the other one? The Calle Ocho. I forget the name of the other major big Salvadorian gang. Great, where that's helping combat the crime or not, that's debatable. The thing is that if you send tens of thousands of mostly men, but certainly some women, to jail, these people, yes, they're criminals. Some of them are probably innocent, but let's leave that aside for a moment. But they're also money earners. They're making money from crimes, but they're making money for themselves and for their families. But if you send the breadwinner, to call him like that, to jail, what are the families? What are they gonna do? Usually, you're gonna have a wife and kids. And that's what the report was talking about. How many families are now suffering because Bukele is not spending enough money on Social Security and providing free subsidies for agricultural workers, farmers and the sort, and that their relatives have been sent to jail, accused of being involved in crimes. Whether that's true or not, that's debatable. Well, now these people don't have any choice. They can either work the land, starve if they don't get enough subsidies, and if there's now a drought, they can migrate to a bigger city like the capital and search and try to look for a better job there and a better life, or they can migrate to the United States. So I don't know much about the situation in the Caribbean islands, apart from Haiti and Cuba being the ones in the worst case scenario. I don't think there's an exodus of individuals from Jamaica or Dominican Republic or Grenada trying to risk their lives crossing the Caribbean Sea. But to your point, yes, that's a major problem, and I think that's what the average U.S. citizen, no disrespect to them, when they say they don't want any more migrants, it's not that they're coming here because they want to; it's because they just have to, because there's no hope for them back home. And obviously, this issue has been heavily politicized in the United States. So if you say you're against migration, then you are, then you are. There's okay. Let me rephrase it. There's no way to. The issue has been so politicized that it's difficult to have a rational conversation about it in the United States.
Well, to your point about gangs and the mass crime waves in countries, formerly El Salvador, but we're seeing the same thing in Haiti, in Ecuador, and we saw the recent efforts by the government to crack down, in Ecuador, it's even more cartel related than just street gang. Really, in Honduras and also Guatemala has had the same issue to a lesser extent. All these countries are going to be facing the same sort of dilemma. If there's going to be a serious effort to combat these gangs, the bottom line is there's also going to be a dilemma of what to do with the rest of the population affected by the arrested gang members afterwards. And this is where I see US having an opportunity to engage, but I don't really see that happening. I see there's a lot of declarations about democracy, not a lot of practical structural support to these countries to provide any sort of redirection for the population affected by these problems. So what do you think can be done in order to create some sort of a cohesive framework for engagement?
Well, let's be honest, nothing's going to get done this year in Washington because it's an election year. So
Right.
any kind of initiative that we can say that the Biden administration should install right now, it could be shut down in 9 months' time if another person comes into power. So let's assume that there's a new administration. Let's assume we're having this discussion on December 1st, when there's already, or January 8th, I believe, of 2025, when there's a new president already installed in the United States. Just that is really to just provide more resources to relevant agencies, USAID, DHS, and the sort, even the FBI and US law enforcement, federal law enforcement agency, so they can train their regional counterparts better to crack down crimes, to be more professional, to ensure that really the person who are sent to jail are actually criminals and they're not just innocent people, bystanders. Let's be honest, that happens a lot. There's a lot, and the problem is so complicated because we can talk about just how to crack down violence. We have to then also talk about how about the penitentiary, the prison system of in each country, which is a huge problem, especially in Ecuador, and we've seen that already in El Salvador, where yes, you have like 20,000 more prisoners, inmates. Where you're gonna put them? You need like a special prisons for that. You have like separate them because of gangs, otherwise you're gonna have a lot of intergang violence, which is what has been happening in Ecuador. And building prisons, building the infrastructure, hiring the correction officers, making sure that these correction officers are well trained and well supplied. It all costs money, and obviously providing food to thousands of prisoners on a daily basis because it's a human right. It all costs money. And if the country doesn't think, if, for example, if the government of Ecuador or El Salvador says, you know what, we don't have that much money, and either we can spend money on improving the quality of life of a bunch of inmates, or building or fixing a school, in Quito or Guayaquil, it makes sense which one they're going to pick.
Sure.
Or which one they're going to choose. So unfortunately, maybe it's a very simplistic answer, but it also comes down to money. None of these countries are rich. None of them have the budgets of the United States, that numbers in the trillions of dollars. So they have to do what they can. I mean, you can talk about, yes, leaving aside the United States, I mean, the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, or relevant financial institutions can provide credits with very minimal interest rates, destined to improve, let's say, the quality of the prison system of any of these countries. They can provide more funds to better supply the law enforcement agencies of these countries, so that one of the major problems also that we haven't talked about is that, especially for Latin America and also like the Caribbean, like in Jamaica a little bit, is that militaries are deployed internally to combat these criminal gangs because law enforcement agencies cannot do it on their own, don't have the number of personnel, the equipment to do it on their own. So they need the military to be deployed internally, and that's a huge controversial, a very big controversial issue dating back decades and decades and decades. So I would say provide funds to revamp and modernize prison systems, provide funds to expand and professionalize law enforcement agencies so they don't have to depend so much on militaries. I think those would be the two key issues to start with. I can mention many more, but I think those are the two ones I will begin with.
Well, basically, it all comes down to where US can spend its money most effectively, and it can do so either by engaging with its Caribbean and Latin American neighbors, or it can deal with the border crisis. So it seems to me that we have already seen what happens when we refuse to deal with the problem on its outset. It comes to the door. I think now we should be having these more clear discussions about reorienting towards a more effective use. I think humanitarian aid, financial assistance, has become somewhat of a tainted word in Washington circles, because so much of it has been given in a way that's been politically controversial among administrations, or simply mismanaged by the parties who are getting it. But some sort of a economic engagement framework that that allows some sort of a more effective financial influence, and in a way that promotes U.S. interests and the values it seeks to, and solves the problems that are clearly identified. That is something I think that should be discussed more openly, but it really isn't. we seem to have stagnated at the issue of just very local prevention thing, as opposed to incentivizing people to go back there to their countries and promising them some sort of a better foundation.
Yeah, I would
Is there
actually
any
say,
way to get past this roadblock? Because at this point, I don't really see either party really looking at that scenario. I see this entire discussion just focusing on very, very local and immediate concerns.
yeah, I don't think it's going to get any better. And how can I answer this question? I understand it also from Washington perspective because donor exhaust is very real. They don't, the Washington, not just Washington, but the world, the international community. For example, let's pick Haiti. The United States has been involved in Haiti on and off for decades, really over a century, since 1930s, with when they sent the Marines, but certainly during the Aristide years in 1990s, and then when he was overthrown again in the 2000s, the international community obviously had a decade-long, more or less, mission via MINUSTA. There was so much rebuilding done after the 2010 earthquake, for example. So it's like Haiti is one example of like just this hole where initiatives, development, financial resources just kind of go nowhere because the international community has been so involved in Haiti for the past couple of decades, and things are not getting better. I mean, the president was murdered just 2 years ago. Like, how can you? That's Haiti's the definition of failed state in the Americas. So I understand that when you have this kind of like examples where things just not work, I understand why as a donor, not just Washington, but also the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, any really financial institution, even European donors as well, they can say, well, why do we keep doing this? Why do we continue to send either our troops or our law enforcement agencies or our or just funds if the situation is not getting any better? I believe that was even an example that happened in Curacao a couple of years ago, where Curacao, being a member of, again, a part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Netherlands said, we're gonna stop providing development money to Curacao because we think it's being mismanaged. So there was a huge scandal between the two, between Curacao and the Netherlands because of it. So I understand why that's happening. So I don't think that can get any better because, again, for Washington and other donors to also continue to donate money to donate or offer credits and loans and send to these countries, they want to believe that, oh yeah, these funds are going to be properly utilized. And obviously, you also want to be sure that the leader in power is a friend of yours. Let's give an example like Bukele. Let's say that Bukele right now says, I want $10 million to help to fight poverty in El Salvador. Well, given his records of his democratic record so far, given his statements, given the way he's behaving toward when it comes to like China, will the United States or European countries say, yeah, we're going to give like all the money you want, even though your attitude's been kind of belligerent towards us? No, geopolitics also have a role. And who's going to help whom, and which country is going to help which country. You help your allies.
Well, to me, it seems to be a very easy problem to solve. You look at this sort of engagement as a business negotiation. You put up your conditions. You basically say, fine, we will consider, because it's in both our mutual interest to solve the problem, these economic issues. We want the people of El Salvador to do better. We also to have good relations on a state level, but we also want you to put an end to this thing with China, and these are the things we expect to return. In my opinion, that's a very fair way of doing business with the neighboring country. If they are neither fully hostile nor particularly happy with the particular position of the US, and they don't have to agree with everything, and we certainly don't have to agree with everything they are doing. We just have to defend our own interests in this matter. Do we have to meddle in every political issue in El Salvador, Ecuador, and so forth? No, but we want to make sure that that our money is not being wasted.
Absolutely.
So I think creating a pragmatic framework for cooperation with these countries seems to be the best way to go, but it seems to me that the US is struggling to define even that for whatever reason.
No, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the point of just US, Latin America, and the Caribbean relations. The United States, and I've said that before, and not just I, but not just me, but several other analysts in DC and elsewhere, that the US hasn't had a grand strategy of how to approach Latin America and the Caribbean for many years. You had like JFK's Alliance for Progress, the Good Neighbor policy by Roosevelt, even the Monroe Doctrine, even though I'm not a fan of it, it was a
Sure.
strategy that you can say these are the objectives. But ever since then, Clinton didn't really wasn't able to do it. Bush not neither. Obama tried a little bit to engage, especially with Brazil, but not more than that. Certainly, Trump was not interested. He saw everything through the eyes of migration. So what you see is that Washington focusing on specific countries. Not when they don't have a Washington hasn't had really any strategy to engage for all of Latin America. They engage Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and they see Venezuela as a threat, as well as Cuba and Nicaragua. That's kind of like about it. And that's not enough, especially for, again, going back to the topic that we have been discussing here, which is the Caribbean. Other than Cuba and Venezuela, for all the negative reasons, other Caribbean islands, the Caribbean island states, plus Belize and Guyana, have not received sufficient attention. Guyana has received attention only because of the referendum with Venezuela, not really because of any other reason. Other countries that have close relations with the United States, they do not get the attention I think that they deserve. They will get occasional visits by some medium-ranking official, but it's not certainly enough. And I would love to see. I think that. I do believe that Biden should try to meet at least once with all the Caribbean heads of state in a summit, at the summit level, before he leaves power. Assuming he doesn't get reelected in November, but we'll see. But that definitely that Washington's at some point Washington's going to have to develop a grand strategy towards Latin America, like it did before, just because the way it's conducting business right now is not enough. And that's something that countries like especially China are profiting from.
It's funny enough. I've talked to various people with very different points of view on Latin America, but they all ended up saying exactly the same thing. US needs a comprehensive strategy for dealing with its own neighbors. And that is something that has been a bipartisan failure for many years, and it needs to change because otherwise we'll be overwhelmed with short-term problems accumulating and turning into long-term disasters. And that I think is the biggest takeaway. I think that needs to be heard, and I hope more voices continue pushing that point. We're already facing so many fires. Another one next door is not something we can afford.
Absolutely. And like I said, just to finish, I mentioned something that I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, that most Latin American countries, especially Caribbean countries, want to engage with the United States. They don't have belligerent governments. They don't have anti-Washington governments. Both the governments and the populations really see the United States as a friend, as an ally, but they just don't receive enough support and attention. And that's a huge tragedy.
Well, thank you so much for these insights. I think the more we discuss these points and push them to the forefront, the more we push public awareness past this kind of ideological morass where we find ourselves today, and hopefully towards a kind of more solution-oriented approach and a more engagement and more kind of in-depth understanding, and not just focus on this immediate little thing that we just see missing the forest for the trees, so to speak, which I think is exactly the current approach. And thank you very much for this very interesting information. I think many people have been missing what is going on in the neighborhood because of all the headlines from abroad, but it's just as important. And I hope things get better, and wiser policies will help make these relationships more constructive for everyone involved. And For everyone watching this program, we were discussing the Caribbean security and other challenges, and as we can see, a lot of them are tied very much to economics and very much to U.S. orientation. And while they do not seem quite dire at the moment, they can be exacerbated and exploited by adversaries, foreign and domestic, if U.S. Stops paying attention. Well,
Thank you so much for the time, for the opportunity to discuss this very timely issue, and I hope to to be invited again and to discuss either U.S. Caribbean or U.S. Latin America relations. I would love that.
absolutely. I think there's a lot to discuss, and I hope to have a panel on this issue in the near future. And for those joining us, please stay tuned for our next program next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining. Have a great night.